The auction on Velmorath's sky above Velmora was purple, burning with twin suns that never slept. Ships hovered like hungry birds over the marketplace, their shadows moving across thousands of cages. Inside those cages were humans, men and women. From Earth, stolen during the silent invasion. They had lost a war they didn't even know had started, and now they were nothing but property. Elias stood still in the center of one cage, surrounded by frightened faces. Some cried, others shouted for help, but Elias said nothing. His eyes were calm, steady, and strangely quiet. He had seen his city fall, watched his family vanish in white light, and somehow he was still here, breathing. Velmorian nobles walked past the cages, dressed in silver robes, eyes glowing like fireflies. They laughed, whispered, and pointed, choosing humans like toys in a shop. But then the crowd went silent. Queen Ruthless had arrived. She was taller than most aliens, her skin smooth and dark, like the sea at night. Her crown sparkled with stardust, and her presence made soldiers step aside. Everyone knew her, ruler of Velmora, breaker of empires, feared across 5-star systems. But she did not look at the crowd. Her eyes moved slowly, scanning the cages. With something colder than hunger, when she stopped in front of Elias's cage. No one breathed. The merchant bowed low and said, "My queen, these are earth males, strong but simple." Ruthless didn't answer. She stared at Elias, who was staring right back at her. He didn't kneel, didn't beg, didn't even blink. Instead, he asked softly, "Are you lonely too?" The guards reached for their shock rods, thinking he had insulted her. But Ruthless raised her hand, stopping them. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she pointed at Elias and spoke. "I'll buy this one." The crowd gasped. Nobles whispered behind jeweled fans. The queen had never bought a male servant before. Not in her whole rule. She was known for power, not softness, for blood, not romance. The merchant stammered. "My queen, he's just a human. She, cut him off," I said. "I'll take him." Within seconds, the cage opened, and Elias was led out in chains. But even then, he walked with his back straight, like a man, not a slave. They took him through wide marble halls, past walls covered in living light. Every servant stared as Elias passed. Why was the queen bringing a human to her wing? No one knew, and no one dared to ask. Ruthless didn't speak to Elias again that day. She watched him from a distance as he was given a clean robe, food, and a private room in the garden wing. It wasn't the slave quarters, it was just 3 doors away from her own chamber. That night, she sat alone on her throne, staring at the stars through the ceiling of crystal. Her mind played his words over and over. "Are you lonely too?" She had crushed fleets, silenced rebellions, and ruled without a consort for decades. But no one had ever asked her that. No one had ever looked at her like that, not as a queen, but as a person. Ruthless clenched her jaw and rose from the throne, her cape flowing like smoke behind her. In the next room, Elias was lying on a soft bed, staring at the ceiling made of glowing vines. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't sure what game this was. She hadn't heard him, hadn't questioned him, hadn't even spoken again. He knew one thing. This wasn't kindness. This was curiosity. And curiosity was always dangerous, especially in the heart of a queen. Outside his window, the twin moons of Velmora began to rise. The garden was quiet, but the air felt thick, like something was about to happen. In her chamber, Ruthless whispered to herself that human didn't kneel. Then her lips curled into the smallest smile she had ever allowed, and she said in a voice only the stars could hear, "This is going to be interesting." The rules of the Palacelius woke up to soft light, filtered through crystal leaves growing from the ceiling above his bed. He was no longer in a cage, no longer shackled, no longer surrounded by fear, but he wasn't free either. He was in the queen's palace, closer to power than any human should be, and far more dangerous than any battlefield a Valmorian made. Entered his room silently, her skin pale blue, her voice flat. "You will serve the queen directly," she said. "You are not to speak unless spoken to. You are not to look her in the eyes. And you are not allowed to leave your chamber without permission." Elias just nodded, calm as ever. The maid paused, watching him strangely, then added, "And do not ever touch her." Later that day, Elias was brought to the queen's inner chamber. It was carved from living stone, glowing with soft pink light and silent music made from air vibrations. Queen Ralav stood near the balcony, wearing ceremonial armor that looked like melted metal and shadows. She didn't turn around when he entered. Instead, she said, "Why do you stare at me like that?" Elias answered simply, "Because everyone else stares at your crown." "But I see you." That made her turn, slowly, her golden eyes narrowing. "Do you know how many beings would die for the honor of serving me?" She asked. "Yes," Elias said. "And maybe that's the problem." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a threat. "Speak again without permission, and I'll have your tongue displayed in the dining hall," she said. But her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. Instead of fear, Elias bowed slightly and replied, "Understood, Your Majesty." The next few days passed in silence, but it wasn't empty. Relith watched him closely as he folded her robes, brought her meals, arranged her court schedule, and moved like he had done this his whole life. She tested him, dropping sharp objects near his feet, ordering him to carry heavy armor, asking questions designed to break a man's pride. But Elias never raised his voice, never looked away, never failed a task. He treated her with respect, but not worship. One evening, she dismissed all her other servants early. When Elias stepped in with her tea, he found her alone, seated by a fire pit of violet flames. She looked tired, not weak, but heavy, like a soldier who'd carried her armor too long. Without looking up, she asked, "Do you hate me?" Elias placed the tea beside her and answered, "No, I pity you." That made her raise her head fast. "Pity me," she repeated, her voice sharp. "You live behind walls, speak only to people who fear you, and trust no one," he said. "I wouldn't call that strength." Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous. She should have struck him, ordered his execution, or laughed him out of the room. But instead, she said, "And what would you call it?" "A cage," Elias whispered. "Built of your own making for the first time in years." Elias couldn't find a reply. She simply sipped her tea and stared into the flames. That night, she didn't summon her advisors or warriors. She dismissed them all and kept Elias in the chamber. He stood quietly beside the fire, not speaking, just present. And in the quiet of that moment, something shifted. From that day, her rules changed. He was allowed to walk freely in the inner gardens, eat from the royal kitchens, and even speak in her presence without permission. The palace staff noticed. They whispered behind silk curtains and digital scrolls. "The queen is losing her mind," some said. "She's playing a strange game." Others believed only the queen and Elias knew the truth. There was no game. She wasn't bending to him, and he wasn't trying to climb. They were orbiting each other like two distant planets, slowly pulled by unseen gravity. One morning, during royal meditation, she asked, "Do you fear death, Elias?" He replied, "No. I've already lost everything once." She turned to him, genuinely curious now. "And if I sent you back to Earth tomorrow, what would you do?" "I'd stay," he said, "not for the gold or safety, but because I've seen something here more human than anywhere else." She stared at him, her heart racing faster than she liked. "You mean me?" she whispered, more to herself than him. Elias didn't answer, but his silence said more than any words. In the shadows, unseen by both, a figure watched them through a flickering panel of light. Someone was spying, and what they saw would change the empire forever. Enemies in the court, the palace of Valmora, had many thrones, but only one crown. And every noble in its halls had a secret wish to wear it. For years, no one dared challenge Queen Ruthless, because her rule was strong and her wrath was legend. But now, something had changed, something small, human, and unsettling. The whispers started in the marble halls and echoed through the floating towers. The queen spends too much time with the human. They said she shares her tea, her silence, even her private gardens with a slave. The court didn't care that Elias had saved her life from poisoned wine. They only saw what they feared: a queen distracted, a human rising high priest. Varzik, who had served the crown for 3 monarchs, called a secret meeting. Valmorian nobles, commanders, and ministers gathered behind closed doors. "She is losing her strength," Varzik hissed. "She smiles at a human and the empire." "Seize it," General Corvel, known for his hatred of earthlings, slammed his fist on the table. "If we allow this, the throne will crumble," he said. "Let me test the human's loyalty the very next morning." The queen was summoned to watch a training match in the arena. Valmorian warriors clashed beneath her golden balcony, but her eyes barely watched them. Instead, she noticed Elias standing at her side, silent, steady, unaware of what was planned. General Corvel approached, tall as a statue, his armor hissing with fire runes. "Your Majesty," he said, with a bow too deep to be honest, "may I challenge your servant to a friendly duel?" Relatha's eyes narrowed. "This is no place for slaves," she said coldly. But Elias stepped forward, calm as ever. "If it pleases the court," he said, "I accept." Gasps rippled through the audience. Corvel tossed Elias a training staff, twice his weight and laced with iron tips. Elias caught it without flinching, his grip firm and balanced. The two circled each other in the sand, one trained since birth, the other shaped by survival. Corvel struck first, fast and brutal, aiming to break bones and humiliate. But Elias moved like wind, ducking, spinning, and dodging with speed no one expected. He didn't attack at first, only defended, reading his opponent like a book. Then, in one perfect moment, Elias used the staff like a lever and flipped Corvel flat on his back. The entire court rose to their feet in disbelief. The queen stood too, but her face was unreadable. Corvel lay on the ground, dazed, furious, and humiliated. When he stood up, his hand reached for his real blade. But Relatha's voice cracked through the arena like lightning. "Enough," she thundered. "He is not your enemy, he is mine." The silence that followed was louder than the fight. Everyone had heard her words, and everyone understood the meaning. This was no longer a servant, not just a human, he was claimed. Back in her private chamber, Elias washed the dust from his arms. Riley entered, eyes sharp as a storm. "Why didn't you break him?" she asked. "Because I didn't need to," Elias replied. "Victory without hate is still victory." She stepped closer, studying him. "You don't fear power," she said. "You just don't chase it. That's why it finds you." Elias replied softly. Later that night, the queen stood alone at her mirror. She touched her reflection, her golden armor, and the strange warmth blooming in her chest. Outside, the stars of Valmora blinked coldly. But inside, something had begun to burn in another tower. General Corvel smashed his gauntlets on the wall. His pride shattered, his anger fed by whispers of rebellion. High Priest Varzik placed a hand on his shoulder. "If the queen will not protect the crown," he said, "then perhaps someone else must." The seed was planted, and betrayal began to grow in the shadows, while the queen looked at Elias not as a slave, not even as a soldier, but as something dangerously close to equal. The night of poison and fire. The palace was quiet, too quiet. The moonlight spilled through the crystal windows like silver blood. Elias walked down the hall with a tray in his hands, tea fruit, and a strange, bitter scent he didn't remember adding. He paused outside Queen Relatha's chamber, sniffed again, and frowned. Something was wrong. He looked down at the tea steam curled upward, but there was a sharpness in the smell, a flower nearby, sitting on a decorative shelf, wilted when the steam touched its petals. Elias didn't hesitate. He kicked open the queen's doors, spilling the tray to the floor. Relatha was alone, standing near the fire. Her back to him. "Don't drink that," Elias said, voice calm but sharp. She turned, slowly, raising an eyebrow. "You dare storm into my chamber?" "I do," Elias said, "because someone just tried to kill you." Before she could answer, a deep boom shook the tower. The flames in the room danced wildly as the walls trembled. Outside, alarms began to scream long, shrill tones that hadn't been heard since the last invasion. Relatha ran to the window, her eyes widening. Her own guard towers were firing at each other, and smoke curled up from the east gate. "This is a coup," she whispered. The betrayal she had sensed, but never believed, was now burning in her own house. Elias was already moving, pulling her toward the bookshelf in the corner. Behind it was a hidden panel he had found days earlier. "I thought this led to storage," she said. "It leads to freedom," Elias answered, pulling her inside the dark tunnel. They ran through stone corridors lit by glowing insects trapped in glass. The queen's heavy cloak caught on a nail, but Elias yanked it free. Behind them, the tunnel shook again, a blast tearing part of the floor loose. Relatha stumbled, landing hard, but Elias pulled her to her feet. "No one's ever touched me like that," she said, breathless. "There's a first time for everything," he replied, still pulling her forward. Outside, the palace gates were crawling with soldiers in black armor not hers. High Priest Varzik's forces had declared her unfit, unworthy. A false decree was already spreading, saying the queen had been poisoned by her own human consort. They were rewriting the truth before her body was even cold, except she wasn't dead. And the one they thought was her servant was now her only protector. Elias led her into the ruins beyond the palace walls. Old stone columns stood like broken teeth, and wild vines crept over shattered statues of long-forgotten kings. Oh. They hid inside the hollow remains of a war shrine, cold and silent, for hours. They said nothing. Relatha sat with her knees drawn up, her crown gone, her hands shaking. "You should leave," she finally whispered. "You're not part of this." Elias knelt beside her. "I wasn't," he said, "but I chose to stay." "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking for the first time. "Because you looked at me once and saw more than a cage," Elias answered. "Now it's my turn." Thunder rolled across the sky, not from clouds, but from ships passing overhead. Valmora was at war with itself, and its rightful queen was now a fugitive. She leaned her head against the cold stone, breathing slowly. "I have nothing left," she said. "You still have you," Elias said, "and as long as you breathe." "They haven't won." She turned to him, and something deep behind her eyes broke free. Without warning, she leaned forward and kissed him, not like a queen, but like a woman who had been waiting to feel something real. The kiss was short, unsure, but it burned deeper than any fire in the palace. When she pulled away, she whispered, "That wasn't royal." And Elias replied, "No, it was human." That night, in the ruins of forgotten glory, the queen and the servant didn't sleep. They watched the sky together, listening to the world burn and the lies being born. And deep in her heart, Relatha swore she would take back her throne, not just for power, but for the man who had touched her soul. Without kneeling once, a queen without a throne, the sun rose over Valmora. But it no longer belonged to her. Queen Relatha watched it from a rocky ridge. Wrapped in a torn cloak, her hands scraped, her pride bleeding. Once, that golden sky had bowed to her command. Now it ignored her like she was dust on the wind. Elias stirred the fire. Roasting wild roots he dug from the hills, the smell was earthy, simple, nothing royal about it. Ralaith hadn't spoken since sunrise. Her eyes followed a hawk dragon flying across the cliff. Free, wild, untouchable. You don't have to. Stay, she said quietly. I know, Elias replied, without looking up. But I'm not going anywhere. She turned to him, hair tangled by wind. Voice hoarse from smoke. You're a human, a slave, and now a fugitive, she said. Why? Risk your life for me. Elias passed her a chunk of roasted root. Because you're not just a queen anymore. He said, You're real now. She didn't answer, but she took the food and ate it. Slowly, it was bitter, dry, but warm. The warmth mattered more. By the third day in the ruins, Ralaith was no longer walking like royalty. She limped, carried her own water, and tied her own hair. Elias watched her rebuild herself without saying a word. Every task she completed made her eyes glow a little brighter. Not with power, but with something closer to purpose. That night, by the fire, she leaned against a broken stone pillar and stared at him. I was raised to think humans were weak. She said, I was raised to think aliens had no hearts. Elias replied with a grin. They both laughed, quiet, tired, and full of truth. You could have killed me in the tunnel, she said. Or run. You could have let me die in the auction. Elias answered. They fell silent again, but this time it was peaceful, not tense. The next morning, she stood over the fire in her battle shirt, her face hard. I'm going to take back my throne, she said. Elias nodded once. You'll need an army. I don't have one, she said, but I have you, Elias. Raised an eyebrow, 1 man against 100 guards. Not 1 man, she said. The man who disarmed my general, exposed a poison plot, and dragged me through fire without flinching. For a moment, Elias said nothing. Then he smiled. If we die. I blame your cooking, she laughed. The sound echoing off the canyon rocks. No one would believe this, she said. A queen and a servant planning rebellion beside a campfire. That's because we're not that anymore, Elias said. You're not a servant, she whispered. And I'm not just a queen. She stepped forward, close enough to feel his breath. I've had generals, nobles, champions, she said, but no one who ever told me the truth without fear. Elias looked into her golden eyes. And what do you want now? He asked. She reached out, gently touching his hand. I want you, she said, not to serve me, but to stand beside me. He blinked, stunned. You're asking me to? Yes, she interrupted. Marry me. The fire cracked. Behind them, the night wrapped them in wind. And for the first time since his capture, Elias felt something dangerous and beautiful choice. He stepped back, just enough to meet her gaze clearly. You don't want a throne mate. He said, you want a partner? I want both, she replied, but only if it's you. He didn't answer right away. He just stepped forward, placed his forehead against hers, and whispered, then let's earn our place. Together, at dawn, they left the ruins, not as queen and slave, but as equals. And somewhere deep in the heart of Valmora, a legend was beginning, not of war, but of love that burned hotter than empire fire. The battle for her heart and kingdom smoke curled into the sky from the mountain's edge as queen. Rillette looked down at her once glorious city. The palace domes shimmered in gold, but beneath that shine were liars, traitors. And the hands that tried to erase her, by her side stood Elias, armored in scrap metal, stitched leather and courage. He held no royal blood, no title, no army. But he had her trust, and that was more than enough. In the weeks since their escape, word had spread, whispers of a queen in hiding, a human warrior by her side, and a promise to return. Outcasts began to appear, disgraced generals, old rebels, even freed human slaves. They came not for gold, not for power, but for her. Ruthless trained with them in the fields under shadowed moons. Elias taught the humans how to fight Velmorian style, turning weakness into surprise. Together, they built an army from broken pieces. And those pieces formed something stronger than tradition. The night before the march, Ruthless stood before her warriors. Her voice rose like thunder wrapped in silk. "They took my crown," she said. "But they did not take my will. They tried to kill me," she continued, "but they woke. Something stronger." She pointed to Elias beside her. "He is not my slave," she declared. "He is my chosen, and if you follow me, he is your commander." Some scoffed at first at human leading Velmorian fighters. But when Elias stepped forward and recited their ancient war code in perfect tongue, the air fell silent. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was one of them. At dawn, they struck. The outer gates fell fast, caught off guard by the rebels' speed. Blaster fire lit the sky, and shouts echoed through the palace walls. Ruthless rode through the main square in stolen royal armor, her blade drawn, eyes fixed ahead. Elias was beside her, using tools and tactics Velmorians had never seen: tripwire coils, sonic flash bombs, human instinct. When they reached the throne hall, High Priest Varzek stood waiting with his loyal guards. "You returned," he spat, "with a human at your side like a pet." "I returned with a partner," she replied. "Something you'll never understand." Elias stepped forward. "I was a slave once," he said. "Now mere reckoning." The battle was brutal. Blades met with fury. Elias fought like a man who had nothing left to fear. Ruthless moved like wind and fire, reclaiming every inch of her throne with each step. When Varzek fell, gasping beneath her feet, she didn't strike the final blow. She turned to Elias. "I'm done with old laws," she said. "Then let's write new ones," Elias replied. By nightfall, the palace belonged to her again, but this time she did not sit on the throne alone. She walked through the royal hall holding Elias's hand. The nobles watched in silence, waiting, wondering. One of them stepped forward and bowed. "Your Majesty," he asked carefully, "what shall we call him?" She looked at Elias and smiled. "Call him king." Gasps filled the hall like thunder in a bottle, but no one protested, because they had seen with their own eyes what loyalty looked like when it bled. They had watched a human fight for her, not for power, but for her heart. Later that night, under the twin moons, the queen and her humans stood on the balcony above the city. The fires of battle had died, but a new flame burned between them. Was this worth it? Elias asked softly. Ruthless leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered. "Because I didn't just win a kingdom, but I won something more." They watched the stars in silence, not as queen and subject, not as alien and human, but as to hearts that had found each other in the ashes of betrayal and the light of trust. The queen and the human Velmora had changed, no longer ruled by fear or tradition. The empire breathed with new life. But the greatest change wasn't in its laws or towers, it was in the way the queen looked at the man by her side. Ruthless now wore no crown inside her chambers. She didn't need it. Her presence commanded respect, but it was Elias who grounded her, who made her more than just a ruler. He wasn't seated at her feet, but beside her at court meetings, holding her gaze when others flinched. The same nobles who once mocked his chains now bowed when he entered, not because of fear, but because of what he had done. He had protected their queen. He had walked into fire for her, and now he walked beside her in peace. The coronation day came again, not for her, but for them. The twin suns rose slowly, casting light across the rebuilt marble steps. Thousands gathered to witness what the galaxy never believed could happen. A human stood before the throne, not as property, but as a partner. Ruthless wore a silk robe embroidered with earth and Velmorian symbols side by side. She took Elias's hand and raised it before the empire. "This man," she said. Her voice, strong and clear, was bought as a slave, but he never acted like one. She continued, "He showed me kindness in silence, loyalty in danger, and love when I believed I could not be loved." She turned to him, her voice gentler now. "Elias, I don't want a king to rule with me," she said. "I want the man who saw me when no one else did." Elias smiled, his voice calm. "I never needed a crown," he said. "I only needed to know you were real, and—" Before the entire court, the queen kissed him again, not as a symbol, but as a woman choosing her future. After the ceremony, children threw flower petals through the royal streets. Humans and Valmorians danced together for the first time in history. Musicians played tunes from both worlds, blending cultures like rivers meeting at last. Ralaith and Elias walked through the crowd without guards. A small child ran up and handed them a drawing to figures holding hands under twin moons. Ralaith knelt and hugged the child gently. Elias placed the drawing in his robe, smiling like he'd never smiled before. Later, in the royal garden, they sat beneath the glowing tree where they first spoke freely. Ralaith rested her head against his shoulder, the stars reflecting in her eyes. "Do you ever miss Earth?" she asked. "Only the rain," he replied. "But I found something better here." "What's that?" she asked. "You," he said simply, and she closed her eyes with a soft smile. The council eventually asked what they should call this new age, peace. One said, "Unity." Another offered, but it was Elias who answered, "Call it the age of choice," he said, "because that's what changed everything." Years passed, and stories spread beyond Valmora. Tales of the queen who chose a human not for politics, but for love, of a man who never bowed but stood, fought and stayed, and of an empire reborn through one act of kindness in a cold cage. Ralaith ruled with wisdom, Elias with heart. They didn't always agree, but they always listened. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it stronger than any tradition. And long after their hair had turned silver and the stars had shifted in the sky, children still whispered the tale of the queen who bought a human slave, then begged him to marry her.